Hello. I'm going to tell a story by Shirley Jackson, The Man in the Woods, published posthumously in The New Yorker in 2014. Christopher went on down the road, wearily, moving his feet because he had nothing else to do, hating the trees that moved slowly against his progress, hating the dust beneath his feet, hating the sky, hating this road, all roads, everywhere. He had been walking since morning, and all day the day before that, and the day before that, and days before that. Days that dissolved seemingly years ago into the place he had left once, before he had started walking. This morning he had been walking past fields, and now he was walking past trees that leaned across the road, bending their great bodies toward him. Christopher had entered the forest at a crossroads, turning onto the forest road, as though he had a choice. He looked back once to see the other road, the one he had not chosen. The cat had joined him shortly after he entered the forest, emerging from between the trees. The cat surprised him at first, and then, oddly, comforted him. The cat stayed beside him and pressed closer to him as the trees pressed insistently closer to them both. Christopher stopped once to rest at the edge of the road. He rubbed the cat's ears and pulled the cat's tail affectionately and said, "Where are we going, fellow? Any ideas?" The cat closed his eyes meaningfully and opened them again. Christopher remarked later to the cat, "Haven't seen a house since we came into these trees. Going to be dark before long." With apprehension, he glanced at the trees so close to him, irritated by the sound of his own voice in the silence, as though the trees were listening to him, and listening, had nodded solemnly to one another. About an hour before dark, Christopher and the cat paused, surprised by a turn in the road, because ahead of them stood a house. A neat stone fence ran from the house down to the road, and smoke rose from the chimneys. It was an old house, comfortable looking, made of stone like its fence. It was easily found in the forest because it was at the end of the road, which was not a road at all, of course, but merely a way to the house. Christopher thought briefly of the road he had not followed. Then, with the cat at his heels, he walked up to the front door of the house. The sound of a river came from among the trees that pressed closely against the sides of the house. The river knew a way out of the forest because it moved along sweetly and clearly, unafraid among the dark trees. Christopher knocked politely on the front door. A young woman opened it and said, "Come in then." He stepped inside, followed closely by the cat. The woman stood back and looked at Christopher for a minute, her eyes searching and wide. She wore a long green dress gathered at the waist by a belt made of grass woven into a rope. She was barefoot. Christopher stood uneasily just inside the door, looking at her as she looked at him. The cat went inside to explore, stopping curiously at corners and closed doors, glancing up once into the dark stairway at the far end of the hall. A voice called from the back of the house, "Phyllis." The young woman smiled nervously at Christopher. "Come along, please. I shouldn't keep you waiting." He followed her to the door at the back of the hall, and was grateful for the light that greeted them when she opened it. It led directly into a great warm kitchen, glowing with an open fire on its hearth. It was well lit by 3 kerosene lamps set around the room. A second woman stood at the stove, watching the steaming pots that smelled of onions and herbs. Christopher closed his eyes against the unbelievable beauty of warmth and light and the smell of onions. The woman at the stove turned to look at Christopher and said with finality, "Well." She studied him carefully, as the other woman had done, before turning her eyes to a bare whitewashed area high on the kitchen wall, where lines and crosses indicated a rough measuring system. "Another day," she said. The first woman asked, "What's your name?" He replied, "Christopher. What's yours?" "Phyllis." She gestured toward the cook with her head. "Her name's Aunt Sissy." "Circe," the older woman said doggedly to the stove. "Circe, I was born, and Circe will be my name till I die." From the way she stood and the way she spoke, she seemed to be much older than Phyllis. Christopher was surprised at the strength in her arms when she lifted the great iron pot easily off the stove and carried it to the stone table at the center of the kitchen. The cat had followed them and now settled into a cozy spot under the stove. Phyllis laid a cloth over the stone table, then set heavy plates and mugs around the table in 4 places. Aunt Sissy asked, "Are we almost ready then?" She swept her eyes across the table, adjusted a fork, then moved over to the wall by the door. She stood there, quiet and erect, and Phyllis went to stand beside her. Footsteps approached from the hall, and after a minute's interminable pause, the door opened. The 2 women stayed respectfully by the wall, and Christopher stood still as his host entered the room. He was a man toward the end of middle age. His face was lined and tired, and he was dressed as the women were, in a long green robe tied at the waist, and he too was barefoot. He stood in the doorway with the darkness of the hall behind him, his eyes bright and curious. He regarded Christopher for a long minute before turning his eyes to the crude measuring system on the upper wall. At length he turned back to Christopher. His voice was resonant. "We are honored to have you here." Without speaking again, he took his seat at the head of the stone table, then gestured to Christopher to take the place on his right. Phyllis sat down across from Christopher, and Aunt Sissy served them all from the iron pot before taking her own place at the foot of the table. Christopher looked down at the plate before him and inhaled the rich smell of onions and meat. He closed his eyes again for a minute before starting to eat. When he opened them and looked up, he saw the dark window. The trees pressed so close against it that their branches were bent against the glass. A tangled crowd of leaves and branches looking in. The old man asked, "What will we call you?" Christopher was looking down at his plate as he replied, "I'm Christopher." The old man continued, "And have you come far?" Christopher smiled nervously. "Very far. I guess it seems farther than it really is." "My name is Oakes," said the old man. Christopher gathered himself together with effort. Ever since entering this strange house, he had been bewildered, as though drunk from the endless trees through which he had come. He swallowed and turned to Mr. Oakes. It's very kind of you to take me in. If you hadn't, I guess I would have wandered around in the woods all night. I guess I was a little frightened. All those trees. He said this with a small embarrassed laugh. Mr. Oakes replied, "Indeed, all those trees." Christopher wondered if he had shown his gratitude adequately. He wondered whether he would be asked to stay the night, or whether he must go out again into the darkness of the woods. When Aunt Sissy filled his plate a second time, he smiled up at her. "This is wonderful. I don't know when I've enjoyed a meal this much." Aunt Sissy bowed her head slightly at Christopher. Mr. Oakes continued, "The food comes from the woods, of course. Circe gathers her onions down by the river. But naturally, none of that need concern you. Tomorrow will be soon enough for you to see the house." "I suppose so," replied Christopher, realizing now that he was indeed to stay the night. "Tonight," said Mr. Oakes, his voice deliberately light. "Tonight, I should like to hear about you, and what things you've seen on your journey, and what takes place in the world you have left." Christopher began to relax, knowing that he could stay the night. "I don't really know quite how I got here. I just took the road into the woods. Before that, I passed a lot of farmhouses and a little town. Before that, I was studying." After an awkward pause, Christopher spoke candidly. "I don't know why I left. One day I was there in college like everyone else, and the next day I just left without any reason except that I did." He glanced from Mr. Oakes to Phyllis to Aunt Sissy. They were all looking at him with blank expectation. He said lamely, "I guess that's all that happened before I came here." Phyllis spoke softly with her eyes down. "He brought a cat with him." "A cat?" Mr. Oakes looked politely around the kitchen, saw Christopher's cat curled up under the stove, and nodded. "One brought a dog," he said to Aunt Sissy. "Do you remember the dog?" Aunt Sissy nodded. After dinner, Mr. Oakes, carrying a candle, led Christopher up the dark stairway at the end of the hall to a stone room at the top of the house, the room where Christopher would stay the night. Christopher's cat followed them to the room. After his host had gone, Christopher looked around the small room. The bed was a stone bench with a mattress of leaves and heavy fur blankets that looked like bearskins. He said to the cat, "This is quite a forest, and quite a family." Against the window of the room, as against all the windows in the house, was the wall of trees, crushing themselves hard against the glass. All night long, the sound of the trees crowding against the house came into Christopher's dreams. In his sleep, he turned gratefully to the cat purring beside him. In the morning, when he went downstairs into the kitchen, Phyllis and Aunt Sissy were in their green robes moving about the stove. When Phyllis had set the stone table and Aunt Sissy had laid out the food, they both moved over by the wall, as they had the night before, waiting for Mr. Oakes to enter. When he came in, he nodded at Christopher, and they sat just as before, and again Aunt Sissy served them all. Mr. Oakes did not speak this morning, and when the meal was over, he rose and gestured to Christopher to follow him. They went out into the hall, where Mr. Oakes paused. You have seen only part of the house, of course. Christopher tried to make conversation. It's a very old house, isn't it? Very old, said Mr. Oakes, as though surprised by the question. Mr. Oakes opened one of two great doors on either side of the entrance. In here we keep the records. Christopher followed him into the room, where Mr. Oakes lit a candle that stood on the stone table by the door. He then raised the candle high, and Christopher saw that the walls were covered with stone shelves. On some of the shelves stood great leather-covered books, and on others lay stone tablets and rolls of parchment. Mr. Oakes spoke sadly. They are of great value. I have never known how to use them, of course. It is my sorrow that I cannot use these things of great value. At one time there were many more, many more. I have never known how they came to be destroyed. Still carrying the candle, Mr. Oakes led Christopher out of the room, shut the big door behind them, and led them across the hall into another room. Christopher saw that it was a large bedroom, and he also saw the window with the trees pressing close against it. Mr. Oakes explained, "This, of course, is where I sleep to guard the records." Again, he held the candle high, and Christopher saw a stone bench, like the one he had slept on, covered with heavy furs. Above the bench were two pegs protruding from the stone wall, and upon the pegs rested a long, glittering knife. "I am the keeper of the records," said Mr. Oakes. Then he smiled at Christopher in the candlelight. "We are like two friends, one showing the other his house." At this, Christopher tried to smile. Mr. Oakes laughed. "Let me show you my roses." Christopher followed him out of the room, where Mr. Oakes blew out the candle and left it on a shelf by the door. They walked out the front door to a tiny cleared patch in front of the house. The forest was barely held back by the stone fence, the trees edging as close to the fence as possible. Christopher felt just as he had felt since yesterday, that the forest was embracing the little stone house in horrid possession. Mr. Oakes now spoke with a warm voice. "These are my roses. I planted them myself. I was the first one to clear away even this much of the forest." He leaned affectionately over the roses. "They need to be tied up against stakes every spring if they are to grow." Christopher nodded. "Someday the roses will cover the house, I imagine." Mr. Oakes turned eagerly toward him. "Do you think so? My roses?" Christopher replied awkwardly, "It looks like it." Mr. Oakes shook his head and smiled. "Remember who planted them." They went back inside and through the hall and into the kitchen. As they entered, Phyllis and Aunt Sissy stood by the wall just as before. Again, they sat at the stone table, and Aunt Sissy served them all. And again, Mr. Oakes said nothing while they ate. When the meal was over, Mr. Oakes stood up and bowed to Christopher before leaving the room. After the table was cleared, the two women seemed to be unusually occupied. Aunt Sissy, at the stove, set down iron pots enough for a dozen meals. Then she disappeared into an alcove and came back carrying the trussed carcass of what seemed to be a wild pig. And she and Phyllis set this on the spit before the great fireplace. Christopher asked, "What are you making?" "A feast," said Phyllis, glancing at him quickly and then glancing away. "And who is coming to your feast?" he asked. Phyllis looked at him, and Aunt Sissy half turned from the stove. There was a silence in the kitchen. A silence of no movement and almost no breathing. And then, before anyone could speak, the door opened and Mr. Oakes entered. He was carrying the knife from his bedroom, and he held it out for Christopher to see. When Mr. Oakes had seated himself at the stone table, Aunt Sissy disappeared again into the alcove and brought back a grindstone, which she set before Mr. Oakes. Deliberately, slowly, with caution, and with love, Mr. Oakes set about sharpening the knife. He held the bright blade against the moving stone, turning the edge little by little with infinite delicacy. Looking up from the grindstone, he spoke to Christopher over the sound of the knife. "You say you've come far." "Quite a ways," answered Christopher, watching the grindstone. "And you were a scholar?" "Yes," said Christopher, "a student." Mr. Oakes again looked up from the knife, then looked up at the estimate marked on the wall. "Christopher," he said softly, as though estimating the name. When the knife was razor sharp, he held it up to the light from the fire, studying the blade. Then he smiled at Christopher and shook his head. "As sharp as any weapon can be." Mr. Oakes looked at Phyllis for a minute, and then at Aunt Sissy. Then, with the sharpened knife in his hand, he walked over and put his free arm around Christopher's shoulder. "Will you remember about the roses? They must be tied up in the spring if they mean to grow at all." For a minute, his arm stayed warmly around Christopher's shoulders. Then, carrying the knife, he walked over to the back door and waited while Aunt Sissy came to open it for him. He stepped outside, and Aunt Sissy closed the door behind him. For a minute, she leaned her back against the door, watching Christopher. Then, standing away from it, she opened it again. Christopher walked slowly over to the open door, as Aunt Sissy seemed to expect he would. He heard Phyllis's voice from the hearth behind him. She spoke softly. "He'll be down by the river. Go far around and come up behind him." Christopher stepped outside, and the door shut solidly behind him. He leaned against it, looking with frightened eyes at the trees reaching for him on either side. Then he pressed his back against the door in terror as he heard the voice calling from the direction of the river. It was so clear, ringing through the trees, that he hardly knew it as the voice of Mr. Oakes. "Who is he who dares enter my woods?"